Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
So I have the distinct pleasure and honor of celebrating the life of Peggy Jo Bedgood Leazer, who was born December 18th, 1934. Peggy grew up in Channelview, Texas. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Channelview is, but if you took a left turn between Beaumont and Pasadena over in the chemical belt, you'd probably wind up somewhere in Channelview. Is that about right, Harley? She and her brother Bobby really had a tough childhood. She actually kind of had to run the household there, but you would have never known it because Peggy never complained. She was a proud woman. That's one thing I can say is Peggy was very, very proud. First of all, she was proud of herself. And first and foremost, she was Mrs. Leazer. She created a wonderful home for her family and their friends, the home that she never had growing up. She was graceful, she was loving, and she was very deeply caring for others. Well-educated, very well-read, and a grammarian supreme. Peggy was never at a loss for discussing politics, especially the recent presidential election, as well as world events. She was well-rounded too. They lived in Kansas City for many years, so all things Kansas City Royals, Chief, and of course, KU basketball. I think Peggy also watched every single episode of CSI ever made. That was Mrs. Leazer, and then there was Peggy Jo. Peggy Jo was confident and witty. She loved telling the story of a boyfriend that she had that taught her how to drive race cars. So growing up in Houston, when the highways were being constructed, the police would actually meet the kids out while they were drag racing and actually help them stay safe. And her boyfriend did something called a double clutch. And she said, well, I want to learn how to do that. And he said, well, I can't teach that to you. She said, look, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it right. Jeff told me a story that one day they had a beautiful 69 GTO. So one day her car was broken down. She had to drive the GTO or the GOAT to work. And a Camaro pulled up next to her and kind of gunned its engine a little bit. So Peggy dropped it into low, double clutched, and that Camaro never know what hit him. She also told me about a time in Channelview when she and her brother were sitting on the porch of their house, and some young man sauntered up wanting to cause trouble for them or the family. So Peggy calmly went inside, got the family shotgun, and promptly asked the young gentleman to remove himself from the property. I'm not exactly sure I have the language correct, but you get the point. Many of the Longhorn Village staff were caught off guard by Peggy with her sharp retorts followed by a cackle and a grin like, how are you today, Mrs. Leazer? Why do you care? She loved doing that. The staff adored her there. She moved to Austin in 1988 from Kansas City to be with her family, and she worked for the Diocese of Austin. So she worked in the marriage annulment section over there. And in that role, she did truly serve God. She offered a lot of sage advice to many a priest on the subject of relationships and marriage. The other side of Peggy Jo, I went up to their house in Kansas City in Stillwell and was having Nancy's wedding ring shipped up there to propose to her on Christmas. And the delivery man rang the doorbell and Nancy's dad distracted her. And Peggy caught me at the door just as I had taken the package from the Federal Express agent. She said, "What are you up to?" And I said, "You'll find out." She said, "You're either going to be a real nice guy or a real asshole." So that was Peggy Joe. The other things about Peggy is she was immensely proud of her marriage and her husband, Don. In 1960, Peggy became the wife of a jet pilot. Peggy served her country while Don was deployed during the military service. She set up and ran their household on numerous bases, taking care of the kids on all of the deployments that Don went on. When Don got furloughed as a TWA pilot, she earned her degree and found a job to support the family. She claimed Don was never the same after coming home from Vietnam, in which she was there to love and care for him until his death in 2003. Peggy was also proud of her family. Peggy loved her children. When Nancy came along at Reese Air Force Base in Lubbock in 1961, and Jeff at Patterson in Dayton, Ohio in 1965, you couldn't have found a better mom. She was a great cook. She had dinner on the table every night. Birthday parties were all special. I don't know if you're going to see the slideshow, but there's so many pictures of birthday parties. I want to be one of her kids. She drove 45 minutes to take the kids to the base swimming pool in Kansas City. When the mobile library came to the neighborhood, she would take the kids down and pick out books for them to read during the summer, which is apparently the highlight of life in Kansas City. Okay. Scouts, softball, soccer, band, flag corps. She came to every single event. Nancy obviously excelled in academics, and Peggy worked tirelessly with her on school assignments and was always willing to share with anybody that her daughter had a PhD. Jeff was like his father, the master of all things mechanical. Peggy would also always tell people that the streets around their house in Kansas City were always plowed first by the snow plows so that Jeff could get to work for the county of Johnson County to make sure that all the trucks could run and plow the rest of the roads for the rest of the night. Jeff is a mechanic at Continental, now United, and she always said, Jeff is really good at his job, and he would never release an airplane unless it was safe to fly. She helped them form a sense of pride and responsibility and are largely responsible for the success of her kids. She was also mom to all of their friends as well. I'm sure there's lots of counseling sessions that happened around the Leazer table, and she gave out lots of advice to people at Longhorn Village. She also was very welcoming to her two new children, Jeff's wife Christy, and also myself, and to the family. And she loved her grandchildren, Bailey and Riley. We would always go down to the house at Shady Hollow for a gut buster, as she called it, which always meant chicken fried steak or fried chicken or something that wasn't really healthy for you to eat. Letting the kids drive the mower around the backyard, remember that? That was lots of fun. Trips to the lake house, letting them sit on the island in the kitchen playing in flour, and getting way too many Christmas presents. Delicious Thanksgiving dinners and the annual debate on how much sage to put in the dressing. That was Peggy. She was also proud of her cats. She was a cat person. Over the year, there was Sam, Benzine, Napalm, Dodger, and probably many others that we never knew. Pictures of cats, cat calendars, cat t-shirts, stuffed cat animals, you name it, all things cat were right where Peggy was. She also loved sharing her cat Dodger with the residents of Longhorn Village. Dodger was also shared her sense of adventure after he once fell 3 stories off of her balcony, and Riley, I think you found him that day. They both had 9 lives, and she was just wonderful to her cats. And finally, there was Peggy, the woman that we all know and love. These are just a few things that we remember today, but she was this and much, much more. Most importantly, we spent a lot of time with her the last couple of years, and especially the last couple of months, she was a spiritual woman who believed in Jesus Christ. We love you, Peggy. Give Don a hug, and we'll see you soon.
In the name of God, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you. Thank you very much. I love the readings that Nancy picked. They're really the same readings that we used for Dawn not quite 13 years ago. But it was wonderful to come back and meditate on those. I particularly got caught by Psalm 139 because I think one of the hardest things for us as human beings is to moment by moment remember, to moment by moment during the course of a day be aware of God's presence in us and around us and within every person whom we meet. We just seem not able to quite grasp that. And yet the psalmist puts it so forcefully. I love this. Lord, you have searched me out and known me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You trace my journeys and my resting places and are acquainted with all my ways. Indeed, there is not a word on my lips, but you know it altogether. You press upon me. I imagine God's hand just gently pressing. You press them all down upon me from behind and before. Lay your hand upon me. And then admitting the truth, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain to it. And perhaps that's why it's so hard for us as human beings to really grasp that at every moment, not just sitting here in this beautiful sanctuary, but every moment of our life, God is there with us and around us, all the way from Channel View and growing up in a hard life, to marrying Don, to raising Nancy and Jeff, to doing what I think is a sort of difficult moment for parents, which is to welcome in someone who might be a nice guy or might be, to welcome in a daughter-in-law, Christy, to welcome in grandchildren into the family. They're easier than the in-laws. And of course, there had to be dark moments. I cannot imagine what it's like to see your husband doing this incredibly dangerous job, being deployed to a very dangerous place again and again, and to know that when he came home, he wasn't quite the same again. And then to have him finally, way back in 2003, not really be a suicide, but a casualty of the war. A dark, dark moment. And yet the psalmist says, even if the darkness covers me, darkness is not dark to you. It is as light and as bright as the day, and you are there with me. Would that we as human beings could really grasp hold of that reality, that even in our darkest moments, God's light, God's love, that luminous love shines in us and around us and in every person that we see. Because it is the light of God's love for us. And we have such a hard time seeing that in the everyday moment. And I suspect it's partly because we set the bar so high. We think that it ought to be in CinemaScope and Technicolor for those of who are of a certain age. And I don't believe God sets the bar quite so high. I think God sets the bar really low for us human beings, and God says, I'm there in the very smallest acts, the acts of becoming a couple, the acts of marrying, becoming a wife and a husband, the acts of having children and raising them and doing birthdays for them, the acts of welcoming in the in-laws and the grandkids and the friends and the cats. Dodger was short for the Artful Dodger. Dodger was a rescue cat. And it strikes me that that's kind of like that bumper sticker, who rescued whom? You know, to see Peggy holding Dodger, you know, just the love he gave her and the love she gave him. That's the love of God. That's that luminous light that shines in the darkness which cannot overcome it. It's those small things. It's those little bitty acts. We set the bar so high. God says, no, it's in the little bitty stuff of every day. And that's where the love and the light of God shines out. And I want to give you something, Nancy, particularly for you, because I had never heard this before, but as I was sitting here this morning meditating on the scriptures, I was reading back through Isaiah 61. The last 13 years, you spent a lot of time looking after your mom. And that's not been easy, because she wasn't quite the same after he died. It was hard. And as I heard the words, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He sent me to bring good news to you, to let you know that you get a garland now instead of ashes. You get the oil of gladness instead of mourning. You get the mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit. You are an oak of righteousness. And now, rest in that. Rest in God's love for you. Someone said to me, you know, every time I was over at Longhorn Village on the north side there at Lantana Lodge or Casa Mesquite, there was Nancy's car. So well done, oak of righteousness. So just rest in God's love for you. Also this morning, as I was meditating on the scriptures in Peggy's life, heard in the Revelation reading, all things will pass away, and I suddenly realized, as much as I love this place, as much as love is contained in this room, yeah, someday all of this will pass away. Someday all of us will pass away. What remains is the purity of all those small acts of love. All those small acts of love that come because the love of God pours ceaselessly out of God like that river of life, that spring of God's life. It is the spring of God's love pouring out unceasingly into the world. And every now and then in those small acts, you and I grab hold of some of it. And in marrying someone, in having kids, in adopting a cat, we embody that love. That's what will remain. And Jesus says, you know, I'm going to pull all of that together. I'm going to this place where there are lots of places to live, and you're going to come and be with me there. And Thomas, as Thomas so wonderfully leads us along the way, says, I don't know where you're going. And Jesus said, yes, you do. I am the way and the truth and life. And what Jesus is saying, Thomas, it's not a particular place like 78204 or whatever. It's not a particular moment in time. No, Thomas, where I'm asking you to come, where all of our ancestors have gone, where Don has been called, where Peggy has been called, it is within the embrace of God's love. It is within the endless embrace of God's light. And I imagine Peggy and God now standing face to face with that love, all those multiple small acts of life simply there between them, shining. And so thanks be to God. Peggy is at rest. And I pray that we may be also. Amen.